Good morning and welcome. I'm Ann McDonough, Deputy Director here at the DC History Center, and we are absolutely thrilled to be hosting today's Caring for Your Collections at Home orientation. If you're not familiar with us, the DC History Center is a nonprofit, community-supported educational research organization founded in 1894. We collect and share the local history of our nation's capital. Our mission is to deepen understanding of our city's past, to connect, empower, and inspire, and we do this work through research and scholarship, youth education, adult programs, and exhibits. Our building is located in the historic Carnegie Library at Mount Vernon Square, and you're always going to find us online at dchistory.org and on social media. Today's program is all about collections, and specifically your collections at home, but I just want to take a moment to talk to you about where you can access the DC History Center's collections. The Kiplinger Research Library, where I'm joining you from, this is not a screensaver. I'm actually here in the library. This is where we provide public access to our holdings. And if there's something in our collection that you want to take a look at, we would love to have you make an appointment to come visit. So this is how today is going to go. My colleague Autumn is going to start with an overview of collections care at home, and then she's going to be sharing examples from the DC History Center staff members' personal collections, including mine and my colleague Katrina Ingram's. At the end of the program, Autumn and I will field your questions. A couple of things that you should know, some housekeeping. We're sharing resources and tips, but this program is also a chance to learn from each other. So please do use the Q&A to chat with your fellow attendees. You can like and you can respond to messages. Throughout the program, I'll answer questions via message, and we'll save some of the questions for Autumn to respond to live at the end of the program. The chat channel is restricted simply so that we can have one place to send you resources and information. You'll find both of those options located on the bottom of your Zoom window. The resources that we send today can all be found in the DC History Center resource guide. So if you lose track of some resources, don't fear. They'll all be conveniently located in one place. We've also enabled Zoom's automatic transcription on this program, and you can turn on captions at the bottom of your screen. We're recording today's program for staff use only, and the program will not be available on YouTube. So we're very, very glad that you joined us here this morning. The DC History Center's collections include an array of personal papers and family papers. And if you're anything like our staff, whether you're moving, downsizing, Swedish death cleaning, raising a family, or exploring your family tree, chances are you have a personal and/or family collection. From photographs to diaries, yearbooks to scrapbooks to decades of correspondence, knowing how to take care of these materials can go a long way towards understanding who came before you and what you're leaving behind for others. We'll be interested to hear from you what tips you need, what questions you have, and where you are in your own process. So let's get our conversation going. In the Q&A, share some of your experiences with at-home collections and where you're tuning in from today. We'd love to hear. And now I am happy to introduce you to Autumn Kalikin, the DC History Center's collections manager who joined our team in 2022. She brings extensive archival processing and collections care experience to this role, as well as a passion for ethical collecting and cultural resource practice. Autumn has spearheaded this orientation, putting careful thought into what essentials you'll need to know. So with that, Autumn, please join me because the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Anne. And as Anne said, I'm Autumn Kalikin, reporting from from the DC History Center collection space. Let's get right down to business. So the goal of this program today is to present practical applications and suggestions, maybe troubleshoot some of your preservation issues, and give you kind of a hands-on look at properly handling archives. But first, let's talk a little bit about personal and family papers. Now, these can include anything from photographs and albums to correspondence, diaries, school projects, yearbooks. What's important to think about with these family collections is that they mean something to us. They have a value for us, our families, and possibly our communities as well. And all collections are different. The collections that you'll see here today from our DC History Center staff are in process, so you'll get to see a little bit of that. If you look on the slide that I've provided, these are actually 2 boxes from our unprocessed Martha Tabor collection. So they're from the same collection. As you can see, they're both in a different state of organization. One of them is quite organized according to the original record holder's organization. The other one seems like it was maybe taken directly from a drawer. Maybe one of these looks like your collections, maybe neither of them do, but this is what we want to really start looking at. When you're thinking about your own collections, you can't save everything, so be intentional with what you select, and it can ultimately save you a lot of stress and create a valuable collection for your future. Perhaps you yourself have been considering taking on a project. Maybe you've already started organizing and you're feeling a little overwhelmed. I'm here to tell you that caring for collections is not some arcane knowledge that only a collections manager would have. It is actually easy, and committing to the preservation of your collections is the first step for yourself and your future. It's already here, which means you're interested in preserving your materials. Let's get started. All right, Anne already kind of gave you an overview of what this program is going to look like. I will talk you through basic preservation actions such as proper handling, creating a stable environment for your collections, archival quality protective storage, and strong documentation. Later, we're going to look at 2 case studies. So next up, we'll be starting with proper handling. Now, as I'm talking about this, some of this is going to seem like common sense, but sometimes we're more casual when we're working with our own possessions than when we're working with, say, collections in a space like this. So the key that I really want to highlight here is patience and care. When you're working with your collections, make sure you're flipping the pages one at a time. Ultimately, once you've decided how to organize your documents, it's good to get in a habit of keeping these in their original order. Just like those collections that I showed you earlier, the Martha Tabor collections, the one on the right clearly had an original order. You may be in a position where you've maybe acquired the records of a family member who has passed that had a clear planned order to them. And this is something that you're going to want to keep in mind when you're working on them. Use 2 hands when you're carrying books, pages, or folders. Don't go just handing off a piece of paper like you're in the West Wing. Just keep it tight. You can support the spines of your books and just be aware of any weak points, especially if they're older artifacts. When you're carrying something like a delicate document or maybe an unframed artwork, you can use rigid support. You can see in this photo that I've used a folder. Even just the lid of a box will create that sort of stable support for your documents. You can see I'm wearing gloves in this photo, but people often ask me about gloves. A lot of people are really worried about the natural oils on your hands and how they could damage documents, but best practice actually is cold, dry, clean hands, unless you're working with photos or directly with a tape or reel. Some exceptions would also be if you have anything that's decaying. I'm going to talk about red rot in leather a little bit later, or mold. Speaking of mold, moving right on to environment stability. So as an archivist, when we're talking about what we want to protect our collections from, there are things called agents of deterioration. They are light, temperature and relative humidity, pests, water, improper handling, and packing and storage. What I really want to focus in on here is going to be those first 3. First of all, light. If you have anything in open storage, like if you have a photograph or a painting on the wall, you may have at some point in your life seen the way that light can damage these photographs. It fades them. If you have anything like that that you're hanging in the house, you can consider maybe making a copy of it and keeping the other one in a dark place, a cool dark place, in a sealed box. Also, just investing in blinds and curtains can really do wonders. What I really want to talk about is temperature and relative humidity. So someone said to me the other day, don't keep any collections in a space that you yourself would not want to be in. And I think that that's pretty accurate. Places like attics, basements, or garages where people tend to keep storage will fluctuate greatly. The humidity, or you want to keep your temperature at 65 to 75 degrees. And again, minimize the changes in temperature and humidity. 40% plus or minus 5% for relative humidity. Mold starts to grow at 65 and can cause rapid mold growth, and anything below 25 can also cause material like paper and leather to get a little bit brittle. If you're like me and you're living in Washington, D.C., you know that high humidity is really an issue here during the summer, so maybe invest in a dehumidifier. The key here again is stability. If you're a little higher than you want to be or a little lower than you want to be, that's okay. As collections manager, I deal with that in these spaces all the time, but the key is keeping those temperatures in a space where they're not changing too much from day to day. Also, be realistic. Sometimes we do have to keep our things in basements and attics, even though we might not want to. That is where our storage space is. So consider your material. Are there things that you find to be very precious? Maybe you can keep a small box in your closet at home. If you must keep material in these locations, Keep them away from radiators, next to boilers, and below pipes. Also, consider your location. Are you in a flood zone? Are you at risk for earthquakes or other weather events? Make sure that you keep those boxes up off the ground in case your basement floods. Just considering little things about your spaces like this can make all of the difference with your collections. Moving on to the next slide. Jumping off of that, preventative housekeeping. Again, you want to reduce those fluctuations, and there's other little things that you can do. Dusting and vacuuming the space where you're keeping your collections regularly, placing sticky traps out for bugs. A lot of bugs that are just going to be in your house on a regular basis actually do eat paper, like silverfish, cockroaches, book lice. And if you minimize dust, actually, you'll kind of make that place inhabitable for them. So think about that. And most importantly, you want to store your materials in boxes with snugly fitting lids. And I'm going to go into that a little bit in our next section. Next slide, please. Sorry about that. Perfect. Actually, before that selection, I forgot I had this slide in. This is just a really basic preservation and conservation slide. I'm actually going to be talking about a lot of this later, so I might move through it very quickly. But some problem materials that you might come across in your own collections, things like newsprint, which is highly acidic. Newsprint that's next to other things will leave a residue and cause staining ultimately, so you're going to want to separate those materials. I always suggest making scans of your newspaper that you've saved on acid-free buffered paper. If you don't want to do that, if you must keep them, please keep them in a completely separate box from the rest of your material. Things like staples and paperclip can rust. Tape glue and rubber bands also tend to degrade. And then, as I talked about earlier, red rot is something that you can find on leather books that were dyed with like vegetable leather. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're keep these things separate. If you see something that's starting to mold or starting to degrade, I would double bag it and place it in a separate box away from your collections. This doesn't mean that you have to get rid of it. It doesn't mean that it's gone forever, but really taking care of your collections and making sure that they're not interacting with each other is the first step. Next slide, please. So supplies and storage. You'll see in a second our DC History Center staff. Obviously, they're people who work at a cultural heritage institution, so they do have a pretty good idea of the type of storage you should be using, but I'm here to tell you. The boxes that we use here in DC History Center are mostly these. They're acid-free, buffered, lignin-free Hollinger boxes. You can see they've got these tightly fitting clamshell lids, and they come in many different sizes. I've got a little bit of a smaller one right here to show you as well. Ideally, you want something with no handhold, so there's not any extra little space where creepy crawlies can crawl in. And then what I would also get if you are just starting out, in addition to the boxes, I would get acid-free folders. And this is just a pet peeve thing, but when you're folding things into these folders, use this. Fill them full, keep that bottom flat. See that fold? A lot of people don't do this, and ultimately it will bend your documents, so don't forget. I also have here to show you, and you'll see some more of these later, just little slides. You can put your photographs in these. They're Mylar, which means that they're archival safe. And then this is that buffer paper that I was talking about. This is crucial. I have a sheet about this size, but you can cut it down to size. If you have a composite scrapbook that maybe has newspaper in it, in addition to photographs, and all of these things are glued down with the non-archival glue, putting pieces of buffer paper between each page is really going to limit the damage that that book sustains over time. Oh my gosh, last but not least, can't believe I forgot. Micro spatula. Get yourself one of these. I cannot talk about it enough. You can use it to lift up those problem staples. You can use it to maybe even get up a photograph. Honestly, they're good for everything. You might hear me talk about them later. I love this thing. It's my life. Moving on to our final slide before we start the case studies. Documenting your history. So as I said earlier, all collections are going to be different. Maybe you're a little overwhelmed. Break down your collection into manageable chunks, maybe by material, maybe by subject, or if there's already a clear order. For example, you'll hear a little bit later, if you have a collection that has a large photograph collection part of it, maybe you just start with that. Maybe you start going through the photographs and see what you have. you want to consider both the current arrangement and what makes sense thematically. When you're capturing this information, you want to consider when was the photo taken, where was it taken, and who is in the photo. And that's not just for your older pictures that you're looking at, the photographs that you're taking now that you're maybe saving to your computer, that you're saving to your iPhone cloud, capture this metadata. You can actually do it in iPhoto. We were talking about it earlier. You may think that this information is sort of maintained through a collective family memory, but I promise you it is not. And it is so much better to assure that these things are recorded. So document events as they are happening. If you're not sure who someone in a photograph is, you can reach out to the elders in your circle. You can maybe consider doing an oral history project, or maybe it's a good time to start a family tree. Also, when I was a kid, my mom made me document all of our archived home videos, and so make the teens do it. You can consider digitizing, you can scan at home what you want, you can even use photographs. If the material is fragile, this is a great way to make sure that you maintain these things into the future. And now it is time for us to move on to our case study now that you've learned a little bit about collections care. These, of course, are the collections of people who work for a cultural heritage organization. Yours might not reflect this level of organization, and that is perfectly fine. It's our collections cam.
Hello again.
Anne is up here with us. And Anne, why don't you tell us a little bit about your collection that you brought for us today?
Sure. So this is all reflecting my life before actually joining a cultural heritage organization. I used to be a travel writer. And so travel photography, travel diaries, the letters, the postcards, all that sort of thing, that actually forms the bulk of what I have as part of my personal collection. So I decided to bring a subset of them here today.
Excellent. So the first thing that I want to highlight from your collection is this travel journal. Now, this journal is a good example of what I was talking about earlier, which is something that's essentially a composite material. As you can see, it has some personal writing. It has things like receipts. It does have newspaper in here. It has, you can see the tape here. And so something like this, oh yes, okay, this is a good example actually. See this newsprint on the right? And you can see, I'm going to hold it up closer to the camera. Yeah.
Oh, it's left an imprint.
Yes, it's left an imprint on this side. So you can see the way that having these artifacts next to each other affects each other. So obviously my suggestion, Anne, for something like this is that it's important that you leave it in the same container, because this is what you created. And the way that these pages are is relevant to your life as a traveler. But you can use that buffer paper that I told you about earlier, cut strips that are just the right size and put them between each page. Now, something like this is maybe not something that you want to prioritize right off the bat. It's a little bit of work to get all those buffer papers together, but I promise you your kids will thank you for it.
If I decide to let them read my travel diary, I don't know about that. I gotta reread it before I decide if that's okay.
Excellent. Well, we have more travel documents from you here.
Oh gosh, this one is from my French exchange when I was 15 years old, so an eon ago.
Yes, and so you can see the discoloration around the edges here. And here, this is, I think I can pull it up. Yes, okay. So this is one of those albums, and maybe if you have sort of older albums in your family, they look like this. It's got like a sticky back to it, and then it's got this sheet that goes on top. And all of these things ultimately will degrade. However, when you're looking at something like this, you have to consider the value of trying to lift the pictures up. These pictures are down pretty tight. Actually, these might come up, to be honest, now that I'm looking at them. So something like this, I would recommend one of two things. Either photograph every image, which I actually would recommend doing anyway. You can remove each of these pages from the book and get rid of this outside book, and then individually folder each of these album pages, keeping them in their original order, of course. Or should you so choose, I would still photograph them so you can remember what the pages looked like as they were and what the captions were. You can maybe take a little piece of unwaxed dental floss, or you can use my favorite thing, the micro spatula, and get these pictures up. Because as I was touching on earlier, I actually do think that the majority of these might actually not be that difficult to remove, solely because the glue in this album is so old. So they actually might come up easier than you think.
I remember actually when choosing that album for this photo scrapbook,
I went with the one with the sticky back rather than the magnetic ones, because I had seen when you open the magnetic ones, things tend to fall out.
Yes.
Right. So I thought at that point I was going with the lesser of two evils. But the glue is probably not the best thing for the images themselves.
Absolutely. And we'll be seeing some tougher glue later. So this is maybe the easier one. Now, and we also have this. This is your slide box. And the first thing that I do want to show off is you can see in the light how dusty this box is. And that's why you put things in boxes, because if Anne hadn't put this in such a nice box, it would be all over her lovely material. So why don't you tell us a bit about that?
Sure. So I have to say that this is an example of a project that I tackled probably 80% of. I have plenty of slides and plenty of 35mm negatives that are in strips, and all I've done is put them in sleeves. Okay, I've taken them out of the little envelopes that my drugstore, photo processor had given me, and I put them in negative holders, and that's kind of all I've done. Right. For this collection of images, this was from a trip in 2004 to India, and I shot the whole thing in slides, and I knew that that's a big investment. And I think that's one of the things we also need to think about, is that people have put a lot of personal time, personal care, and a lot of money into creating these memories, right? So you do want to protect your investment in a lot of ways. So with this one, what I did was I put the slides in slide holders, and on the side of each, I put the location where they were shot and the day they were shot. So that way, even if I didn't have more information, I didn't have my wonderful travel diary that told me exactly which temple I went to on which day, I'd be able to look back and recognize where these images were from. You can see that I tried out a couple of different ways of labeling these slides. The first one, I'm using, oh goodness, this is a marker, which I would not suggest using on slides, because as you can tell, it's smudged. And I also thought I was going to fit so much information on the little frame of the slide. So I did one, I saw that's not going to work. So then I went to a ballpoint pen on the second slide, and that's better because it's not smudging. But again, I went for too much information on the slide itself. Now, this would be very helpful if I didn't have a document somewhere that told you more of that information. But also, I don't know if you can see, I'm going to show you. Look at how many slides I have here, right? If I was never going to finish this project if I continued to write that much information on each slide.
Be realistic.
Right, exactly. So I sort of like pulled back and I said, where can I really have the maximum impact, right? And so the maximum impact was numbering the slides. That I could do with a marker because it was not a lot of text. And by numbering the slides, if something fell out, I would know where to put it back in sequence. But also it meant that I could create a document where I would say slide 1, and I could have as much text as I wanted to because I'm typing this and I'm not handwriting it. So I do have a document that tells me more about each of these images. You can copy and paste when you're doing that. So if it's 10 images of a temple, you can write that once and paste it twice, 10 times. So that is all wonderful and fabulous. And I'm very glad I did put it in this clamshell box. But what I didn't do, and I would recommend anybody who goes through the trouble of actually creating a document with all that information, don't leave it on your computer.
Leave it on your
Print
computer.
it out,
Or put it on, and
please.
put it on the cloud. Do both.
Sure, but at the very
definitely
least, print it out and keep it with this material. So I would put it right here. And so then anybody, you wouldn't have to be with me in order to understand where the import of these photographs and where they were taken.
So how will you, if you wanted to start figuring out what these slides are, how would you do that, being as distant as you are from the traveling time in your life? Well,
again, luckily I did keep a very detailed travel diary. And that's why I keep things like receipts and menus and entry tickets. It's fun during the trip itself, but it's a wonderful sort of memory sparker later on.
Yes.
And so whether it is, I created my travel diaries for me. Okay, I didn't create them for, the historians of the future who want to, study my life, because nobody's going to want to study my life. I created them for me, but I've recognized that it helps. It was for me at that time, but it's helping future me as well, because that trip was 20 years ago. And I can go to my travel diary and I can actually refresh my memory if I didn't have that detailed document
Yes.
already.
So you can
So
cross-reference.
I would cross-reference. Thank you for bringing that library and information term into the idea. But I would put a note in this binder
Mhm.
with all the details. I would say, go check your travel diary too, because I know it exists, but I may forget one day.
And then when you're deciding to store these things, and this comes down to storage, maybe you make sure that these objects are stored together or in a similar location so that you're not wondering where your travel diary is.
Exactly. I would keep them close by, but I
Not the
wouldn't
same
put
place.
it in the same.
Yes,
Because they have
absolutely.
different preservation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right.
What did I bring?
Yeah, I've got one more thing to talk about you with.
My correspondence.
Correspondence. So again, as you're looking at these, you can tell that Anne is a collections manager. Take a look at this. We've got, I'll hold it up to the camera. You've done a great job of documenting these, and you decided on an organization.
I did. I wish I had better penmanship, but I don't.
That's all right.
But I can read the fact that the folders are labeled with letters and then the year. And then I put 2. Now, this is again, maybe getting a little precious. You don't have to get as precious as I am. But I do have both letters I've received and letters I've sent. And I kept those separately in my own personal papers. You can also see as you're going through this, that I've kept the letters mostly in the envelopes. Now, this is a project I got like 50% of the way through. And I said, you know what, it's good enough right now.
Yes,
My next step
I want to do that.
is I would take the letters out of the envelopes, keep the envelopes with it, because that tells me a little bit about when they were sent, because not everybody dates their letters these days, right? And oh, that's my grandmother's beautiful handwriting.
Is this the one?
Oh, so this is, my grandmother had gorgeous handwriting that I would recognize anywhere. She signed this, but she also sent me a letter once, and I don't even remember if it's in here or not, from your secret admirer. And I knew who it was because I recognized her handwriting, but I recognized that my kids are not going to necessarily know her handwriting. So maybe I would put a little note on it these days in brackets saying, you know, Nana Kraus.
Well, and also, so when you're organizing something like this, I'm going to say buffer paper again. I'm sorry. You can get buffer paper between, maybe if you have a letter. So like, let's go back to this first one. So obviously, as an archivist, I would suggest removing the letters from these envelopes and unfolding them, and then just not folding them ever again. But what you can do is you can keep the envelope with the letters still and just put buffer paper between each individual one, thus showing that those two are tied together.
Right.
And then you can write on the buffer paper in a little bit of soft pencil. You can write that your grandma is the one who wrote that. If
I love it.
Not immediately apparent.
I'm not
because she
changing.
signed it secret admirer.
Yeah, I'm not changing the original artifact. I'm just adding extra context.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, don't write directly on it, but it's a little nice. Perfect. Well, and as we're coming to a close, you're still working on this collection. What's one thing that you learned as you were processing it?
Oh gosh, well, I learned a lot. I think being too precious again is something that will hold you back. So maybe make a plan and then say, if I get 50% of the way through, I've done a really good job and it's better than it was before.
Yes.
And then I think the other thing that really comes to mind is that in going through this is that really this is a chance to be a steward of your own story. Again, I don't know if I'm going to want my kids to read my travel journals, right? Deciding maybe I think, you know, maybe in 15 years, this will actually be a really great thing for them. So thinking about what I want to leave behind. And what are the things that maybe meant something to me at one point, but don't really speak to my life as a whole. And maybe those are things I can actually let go.
Yeah, I think that's really, really beautiful. And thank you for bringing in your collection for us to look at. I appreciate the vulnerability.
Thanks for going over it with me.
Thank
Appreciate the
you.
tips.
Excellent. Well, now that we've finished that segment, I would like to invite on our senior audience engagement manager, Katrina Ingram, who has also brought a collection for us. Now, Katrina, why don't you tell us a little bit about your collection as I pull some stuff out?
Sure. Well, I came into a lot of these photos when my grandmother passed away. They belonged to my grandfather's father. But then I also came into them when my sister bought my mother's house and wanted me to clean out the basement. And I didn't want to see anything go away, in the trash.
Yes. And sometimes that's what it is. Sometimes you have to be the one to take on these family projects because no one else is willing to.
Right,
And I do,
exactly.
I identify with that a lot.
Yes.
So what struck me about this, of course, as you can see, Katrina has invested in those nice archival acid-free boxes that I was telling you guys about. This is great because she's created this divider where these are the things that she has processed already, and these are the photographs that she has yet to process. And this is as she brought it in. I want to say we didn't stage this. This is all Katrina. And she also has the sleeves that she's using for photos here. So what really struck me about this, Katrina, is that you have, I'm gonna hold this up, done a very good job. Still getting used to the camera. There we go. Documenting these things, and you've done exactly what I, as a collections manager, would be looking for, which is you've included the date, you've included the location, and a lot of these photos, I think you said had who was in them on them.
Yeah, these are ones from the 60s, not so much, but I do know the only reason I know them is because there was this little sticky note from my grandmother that I still have here. So that was from a trip when my mother was a kid. And then if you go a little further back, it's photos of that came from my great grandfather.
These photos came from your great grandfather, and this is one that I think about since you showed it to me. Here is a boy, and if you flip it over, you can see that it is labeled, but the way that it's labeled is, guess who? Which is a funny way to do that. And I would consider this too, when it's much like Anne's, her grandma signing it, secret admirer. So did you know immediately who this was, or did you have to do a little digging?
I had to, so all this red writing on the back I had thought was from my great grandfather. And then when I saw this one, I was like, wait, this might actually be my grandfather writing on the back of his father's photos, which is what I think this is of my grandfather. Because he was born, just based on the clothes, I think, and the age of the photograph. He would have been born in the early 20s. So
yeah, I really love that.
Yeah.
And there was another one from this box in particular that I wanted to highlight from when we did our consultation. And it is this one. To the camera. Now, what can you tell me about this, Katrina? You've got a story.
So this man here is my great grandfather. And there are several pictures of them in these bathing suits, and I have yet to figure out what they are representing. But it's, I believe, in somewhere like Coney Island, because he lived in New York. And I just thought it was such a cool picture of him and his friends that I scanned it and blew it up, and it's in my bathroom now. And I just really love it, looking at it every day. So
yeah, I love that. So I really encourage people to sort of look towards these digitization opportunities, because it's the best way to maintain your photographs and keep them visible, because obviously what I would suggest for you to do is to keep these in your acid-free boxes tight and away from the light. And so maybe that means you're not bringing them out as frequently as you would like to. But what you can do is, and Katrina, I don't remember where this is from, so I know you know, so I'm just going to put it in here straight like this.
okay, we'll fix it later.
What you can do is create these preservation scans or digitized photographs. When you're doing that too, since we're here, I'll tell you, I would suggest initially doing the scan in a TIFF format. If you're not familiar, something like a JPEG is actually going to degrade in quality every single time you open it on your computer. So I learned that from a digital archivist a couple years ago, and it did blow my mind. So I want to pass that on to you. Scan in TIFF, and then you can create a copy that maybe you want to open, maybe you want to put it on Facebook, and that's your JPEG. But definitely original scans, TIFF format. All right. We'll put this here. So Katrina, I wanted to highlight this box as well, because what it does is it sort of shows you have a lot of photographs from the 1920s, older photographs of your family. But this box is something different entirely. So these are your personal projects from when you were a kid.
Yes.
Yes.
So these are basically, this was a box I put together. These are big photos that were too big for the other box I was using, and there were things I just didn't want to take out, and I wanted them to stay together.
And you're keeping them flat, which is a good move. Something that I wanted to point out, I talked about staples and paper clips earlier. You can see I'm not actually going to move it, because frequently when paper clips get a little rusty, they actually get a little stuck. Microscopic. But take a look at this. You can see sort of how it's rusted in place. So when you're doing your own processing with your own collections, archivists use this term. It's called MPLP, which is more product, less process. And that basically means if we're working on a large project, we might want to consider what we're prioritizing. And maybe the thing that we're prioritizing isn't necessarily removing every single staple, but you come across a really rusted one, you take that one out. So it's considering how much you're working on, what kind of time that you have. But if you have a relatively small collection and it has some staples on it, just take them out. Take them out, be very gentle. And then what you can do is when you're foldering these things, in order to keep the pages together as they were, buffer paper. Buffer paper on either side of an original document, and you can just line them up like that, which is what I've generally done my whole career. All right. I've got one more box from you, Katrina. I really love your collection too, because you've utilized 3 different size boxes. This one's quite tall, actually. The collections cam is a little tall, so I'll open it here and then I'm probably going to move it. Yeah, but you can see again, she is utilizing those folders. She is.
I don't know for sure. These are acid-free boxes. They were from the Container Store.
Yes, and so I would say probably not with that in mind. We're going to have some resources in the LibGuide that we're including that will show where you can get these objects, but a lot of it is just make sure that you're reading labels. You're looking for acid-free, you're looking for buffered. If you're ever in a situation where you're putting things in plastic sleeves, try to avoid PVC. It stands for polyvinyl chloride, and they use it to make pipes, they use it to make raincoats, they use it to make like plastic holders, and it basically will like melt. It gets very discolored and it melts in heat. So just like avoid that at all costs. That's the thing when we're getting collections in, we look for because it really can damage collections in the long run. So I wanted to pull, I've got 2 things in this box that I want to highlight before we move on to question. Give me 1 second to get this all set up. All right, how's that? Okay. So this is, why don't you tell me what this is actually?
Sure. Okay, so in what I grabbed from when my sister bought my mother's house, this was a project that my younger sister did in, I believe, middle school. It was a project about her life, and so she has several pages of images that are original images that were glued down to the paper. And the only reason this one is removed is because it was a Polaroid and much easier to come off. I tried to do the other pictures and they're stuck. So instead what I did was scan the whole page and just cropped them out so that I could have individual images.
Yeah, and I mean,
left them as it is.
Yeah, that's what I would recommend as well. And I also think because this is such a cute and kind of personal school project, and I'm personally very taken by these captions, these handwritten captions, is that when you're doing those digitizations, you maybe keep a photograph of the original, or a scan of the original page as well. Yeah, as well as the photographs. But yeah, and
Here I am on my first day.
Yeah, and you'll find a lot of stuff like this. And even older albums will be construction paper and they'll have glued them on the back. That was really common. If you're making an album now, I would recommend using photo corners. They're really easy. And then you can take the image out very simply. If you're dealing with a family album that did use photo corners, I must simply suggest using the micro spatula to just get those out from the corners. Then you're not bending the photograph, especially if it's been in a situation where it's in an environment that's been fluctuating. You never really know texture wise if the photograph's a little brittle, what steel is. So yeah, just use that, pop the little corners out.
I will say I am using photo corners on the baby book.
Yes,
for my son right now.
See, and then you learn lessons. Yes. And you can do it better when you're the one doing it. Yes. All right, I've got one more thing that I want to close on. Where is it? Here it is. Excellent, excellent, excellent. This photograph. And why don't you tell me what you're here?
That is me. This is probably 1987. If you can't already tell by the outfits.
Your hair's really red in those.
My hair, yeah. And this is of my mom and dad holding me. And it was in a frame. So against glass, and you can see that when I pulled it off the glass, it got a little stuck there. thankfully not on anyone's face or clothes. So in what I made a scan, and in the scan, I used Photoshop to remove that. So that was like sort of
Yeah.
lucky, but if you are unlucky, I don't know what you would suggest.
I can tell you. I would suggest, I mean, especially in this case where it wasn't on anyone's faces, scanning in Photoshop, and if it's still in the glass frame and you come to that realization that it's a little stuck, if you can, and glare is a thing, but scan it in the glass. Like, don't try to take it out. If you're having trouble, leave it in the glass. And actually, I would just like wrap those glass plates in buffer paper and store it as such rather than try to get it out. And what causes this to happen is that thing that I was talking about earlier with relative humidity. When the humidity is fluctuating in a space and two pieces of glass are together like that, it can create moisture. And when moisture is up against the front of a photograph, it like loosens it, like the chemicals on it enough that it makes it extremely sticky, and then it like adheres itself to glass.
Yeah.
This is what happens. And now, okay, you can look online and you can find sort of DIY ways to deal with if you have a photograph stuck to glass. I'm not going to recommend any of them here because I'm an archivist, but I will tell you that you can do that. I will suggest that you go to a paper conservator if it's a very important piece of history for your family.
Yeah.
But there are ways. Well, Katrina, you've been working on this for a while and you're still working on it, right?
Yes, I did a lot of it, in the pandemic when we were all doing home projects.
And a great time to do it too.
Yes, I've gotten to a place where I was comfortable. I removed sort of photos from the albums they were in mostly, and I've gotten to a place where everything's in a new box. And but yeah, I am still working on it. I will say that in the process, I would say if you're embarking on a project like this and you come into many different types of materials, that's where I got sort of overwhelmed at first.
Okay.
But then I sort of was like, okay, well, I'm gonna just organize this by type, and then from there
That's a good way
go.
to
Yeah, because that also helped me pick out what boxes I was gonna need, what size I was gonna need.
Well, and if you're working with photographs too, and you're maybe working with a part of your family that you don't know as well, sometimes if you start there, you can identify some of the people in the photos, you'll be able to identify them later in photos that they're maybe not, aren't like documented in the same way and aren't captioned. So just considering kind of, if you have, so we didn't really get to this because we're coming up on the Q&A portion, but Katrina also has a family file folder that you've added to that includes like correspondence and newspapers that you found and printed out, right? Am I
Well, it was as part of what I got from my grandmother. There was also letters, and there were like my aunt's diplomas from high school. I'm holding on to them for some reason. But yeah, there's just other kinds of material that I had to pull out.
But you did some additional research.
Oh yes,
is what I'm
I
trying to
see what
get
you're
at.
saying. Yes.
Yes.
Oh,
And then you can make that folder and keep it in with your family collection so that the next person who comes in to look at it can see the research that you've done and learn from it.
exactly. Yes, it was my great grandfather. His name changed at a certain point, so there was material related to that.
Yes, and that might be something that would really stump someone in the future. So if you ever find that you're in that position, especially if you're making a family tree, just like keep those documents. And I know I said that thing about the cloud, but I'm like, keep it in the cloud, keep a physical copy.
Is it 3 places? Is that
Yeah, 3 places is the recommended in an institution like this, because then we also like to keep like a separate hard drive. But every cultural heritage institution that has collections like ours almost certainly has physical copies of files, because that's just best practice for making sure that we know where the stuff came from. All right, well, thank you so much, Katrina. And I think we're gonna
I'll be over here.
move on to the Q&A section.
That was really awesome, guys. Katrina, I loved seeing you as a baby. So cute. So I'm joining you back in the Kiplinger Research Library again, and we've had some really great questions that have been posed, some of which we have answered in the queue. So some of the more sort of detailed ones are there. So I'm going to kick it off with so please do continue to send questions in to the Q&A queue. We're going to get to as many as we can. But I'm going to take the liberty of starting off with a question of my own, if that's all right. And Autumn, way back in the presentation, there was a slide of an old book with a leather binding, and you were talking about red rot. Now, my guess is that sort of binding could be found when we're talking about like family papers. It could be found on like a family Bible or a publication that an ancestor created, and you want to keep that not just what's inside the printed material, but the actual physical item itself. Can you just talk a tiny bit about red rot? And because I'm sure some of us have run up against that in our own homes.
Yes, red rot is something that's close to my heart because as a collector of old books, personally, this is a problem that I have. Red rot is what happens when leather that's been dyed with like vegetables decays. It is irreversible, but that shouldn't make you panic. It just means that when you have these books, the best thing that you can do for it is get like larger sheets of buffer paper and then basically fold it around. And then I would just label it with what book it is, maybe like publication and year. And then I was going to bring some up, but I didn't. But we have sort of cloth tape that you can use to tie around it. So it's not in the same way that like twine, if you tie it too tight, might cause an indentation. Cloth tape is very forgiving and gentle in that way. And I would just wrap it up and except that you're not going to get to look at it all the time. And then when you take it out, this is something that I would consider handling with gloves, because if you've ever touched a book like this, the red gets off on your hands. It can be very messy and it can create a lot of dust.
Mm-hmm. Okay, cool. Thanks for going over that. All right, so now I'm going to jump into some of the questions from the queue. Let's see. We have several comments, by the way, Autumn, on how folks wish they could have had their younger relatives join them for the program today, because it's several multi-generations are, of course, looking at preserving family papers. Okay, can you use? We've got a question in from Sandy Hoxer. We've got this question in a couple of different forms, so I'm just going to use this one. Can Xerox paper be used as buffer pages?
Can Xerox paper be used as buffer pages?
I have some thoughts, but I want to tip it to you first.
That's a good question. I think I personally wouldn't. I would not. And I would probably just make sure that I'm buying the acid free, because I'm not sure, is Xerox paper acid free? I don't think that it is. Yeah, okay. No, definitely. Yeah. It's that acid free thing, because you saw the way that newsprint like decays and gets discolored and reacts with other things. And I actually think with some like older business records that I worked with at previous institutions, that Xerox paper and
mimeograph, like the
yes, that's the I was like, you know what word I'm talking about. Yes, that stuff will do that over time too. So previously what we would do at my previous contracts is we would make preservation scans of those in order to keep them, and we would do those on the acid-free paper.
Okay, cool. And one little tip, if you have Xerox paper at home and you go out and you purchase some acid-free paper, the way you can tell them apart, sometimes the coloring is a little bit different, but the way acid-free paper, if you hold it up to the light, you'll always see a watermark. And that is a good sort of tip for keeping your more expensive acid-free paper apart from your less expensive Xerox paper. So thanks for that question. How about some recommendations for storing large paper items like newspapers, maybe posters, that sort of thing?
Yes, so I will say that if you get into some of these archival supply stores that we've linked in the LibGuides, there are boxes of every size that you can possibly imagine. So depending on what the material is, and if it is already something that is laying flat, I would invest in one of those boxes. I'm trying to see if I can pull something for you. I might actually. Give me 1 second.
Absolutely. While you're looking for that, I'm just going to mention that we focus today really on the physical analog materials rather than all of the various things that go into digitization. There are a lot of questions about digitization, so I'm just going to tackle one of them just while you get ready. One is that Marilise has a pro-grade Epson scanner that can handle actually, that's not the one. There was a question about your scanner only offers two options, PDF or JPEG. Since we're not recommending JPEG since it deteriorates, which one of those two should you choose? And I would go out on a limb and I would say, if those are your two options, and you can't turn on the pro mode, as Kirk Heflin has joined in to say. Thank you very much. You feel free to answer each other's questions, by the way. If you can't turn on the pro mode, then scan its JPEG and save those JPEGs as TIFFs. That will only be the tiniest infinitesimal amount of degradation, and then you have a TIFF from there. And again, thank you, Kirk. And with that, I'm going back to you, Autumn.
Excellent. I just wanted to show, because I'm up in the collection space, this is actually the exact thing that I pulled for the photo that I used on the slide on object handling. I really wanted to show, this is maybe not something that you would have in your collection, but it does have this Mylar sleeve, which if you're storing bigger objects, maybe individually, I would recommend maybe investing in these. And you can see, again, because it is delicate, it's kept on this folder backing, acid-free. And then I also just wanted to show you, again, boxes come in a million different sizes. This is a box that we have here. And this is the box that this came in. And then also when things are, we didn't really talk about if objects are already rolled. If they're already rolled, I would not recommend you trying to unroll and flatten them, especially I said that thing about when humidity is low, things can get very brittle, but you can actually purchase like long buffered cardboard rolls that you can put posters or any like large thing in. I would always recommend storing things flat, but also realistically with space, sometimes that's not an option for people who are doing this at home. So I would look into that. And these are all things that are available on those archival sites.
We have a question about, is it better, this is from Cheryl, is it better to put photos in albums or keep them in photo boxes?
Ooh, interesting. Personally, I would probably keep them in a photo box, and I would also make sure that I was using individual sleeves or buffer paper between them, but albums aren't a bad thing. I don't want you to feel like because albums have like a really important function, especially within families. My grandma is like a scrapbooking master and we pull them out every holiday. And so I think if you're going to do that, I would really commit to, first of all, get your albums and stuff from a scrapbooking store. Like go there, the products that they have there are actually made to last in this way. And you actually will find quite a lot of acid-free paper there. You'll find special tapes and special glues, kind of comparable to the stuff that we would have as like our tools within the archive. So I would go to a real scrapbooking store or go to real scrapbooking stores online. And then I would suggest going for photo corners if you were going to do that. But yeah, I don't want you to feel like photo albums are an option. They are. Or you can get one of the ones that you can put the sleeves, the photos in the sleeves. And again, I would just make sure that that's archival quality.
Mm-hmm. Great. Betsy McDaniel sends in a little plug. Would it be possible for the DC History Center to sell archival materials and generate income from the sales? Betsy, thank you for that idea. We do have a retail shop here at the DC History Center. Can I just have a little kind of show of hands in the Q&A if, whether you're local or you have your own historical society in your town, would you be looking for sort of a curated selection of archival materials to help protect your collections at home? Put yes in the chat, in the Q&A, if you think that that's something that we or other repositories should look into, sort of culling some of the more traditional and useful resources for photograph collections, diaries, that sort of thing, to sort of make it a little bit easier, because it can be kind of overwhelming when you go to the store and it's like, oh my gosh, all of the different options are out there. So Betsy, thank you for that question.
Before we go to the next one, can I just speak on that? On that note, if you stick around after the program for the survey, we're actually doing a raffle if you fill out the survey, because it's important for us to know how the programs are going. We're doing a raffle for a little kit where you'll get a little starter kit of archival supplies from Gaylord, which is an archival supply store.
Awesome. This is more about organizing the papers. From Mark Jones, when deciding how to organize collections of letters or photos, are there any universal standards for determining subject headers? Like an archival Dewey Decimal System of sorts? Are there specific ways of cataloging or organizing materials that will make it easier to donate a collection to a library later?
So to answer your first question, I would say No, it's very interesting because every single collection that comes into an archive has to sort of be taken from scratch. It's interesting to try to train people in archives for that reason, and there's a lot of creativity to it because it's really looking at a whole collection. It's called surveying. You start to finish, look at everything that comes in. For me, if I were doing it, I would look at every single document just really briefly to get a good idea of what we had before I made that determination. And it is going to be different for every single collection. Some things, some little tips to hold true. I said the thing about keeping objects in their original order earlier. If you're working with, a personal collection where somebody took things directly out of their filing cabinet, you're going to want to really consider that. If it's more like the other box that I showed you at the beginning, where it's kind of piecemeal, I would decide if I was going to be organizing things by type, being like, these are photographs. And then that is something that we would call a series. And a sub-series is going to be, these are photographs by year, or these are photographs by subject. Katrina had her family vacation photos. And so if you have 10 family vacations, and then you're doing each of those family vacations by year, and just creating little pockets, this is what folders and buffer paper are good from. So there's really no standards with regards to that. What was the second question? Will you remind me of that?
Is there something that would make it easier for a donation to be made to an organization? Like what sort of documentation, what sort of documentation would be helpful to make a personal collection more applicable for a collections donation?
Yes, absolutely. So when I'm taking collections in, I generally actually make an appointment to talk to people, or we talk on the phone so I can hear about these things, because what I want to know, if it's photographs, I want to know if you know who's in the photo, if you know the locations. Of course, I want to know if it's DC in our case, and what the year is. And then another thing that's really important to us when we're taking things into our repository is something called provenance, which allows us to establish that where the artifacts came from and that you have legal rights to them. So if you have a bunch of pictures, I would ask you, where did you get these from? So in Katrina's case, I would ask her that, and she would tell me about maybe her sister's basement, and or that they came from her grandfather and that they were her grandfather's collection. And this is important for museum legal reasons, and also just important for getting the context of the collections and sort of understanding where it fits within a repository and also within a life.
Autumn, well, thank you so much. That actually is, I think, the perfect question to end our Q&A on. And thank you to everybody who says, yes, 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 we should be selling archival kits here at the DC History Center. These programs are very iterative. We created this particular program because people asked for tips on how to care for their collections at home. And so seeing in the queue that there are a lot of questions about scanning, about slides, that sort of thing, we will definitely keep in mind for future programs. Maybe that could be one of the next collections orientations that we do. So your feedback is very, very important to us and helps us decide what sort of programming is really necessary and that we should be doing. So thank you for that. I wish that we could answer everybody's questions, but I hope that the ones we have covered address some of your concerns, or maybe you've met somebody to learn more from today, either on screen or in the chat. Thank you again for folks who chimed in and answered other people's questions. We really appreciate that. We recommend that you review our online guide to everything that we've talked about. It is a living document, and we'll be adding more resources to it. So if you check it out today, don't think that in 6 months you won't want to check it out again. It's available in the chat one final time, and it's also going to be in the emails that you're going to receive about this program. As Autumn mentioned, if you fill out our post-program survey asking for feedback, you will be in the lottery to win a kit with archival supplies. So make sure to include your email in the survey, and you can find that link in the chat and again in the post-program email. Thank you again to Collections Manager Autumn Kalikin for sharing these tips with us today, and to Katrina Ingram and behind the scenes Marin Orchard, our producer, for their program support. We hope that you're going to join us for a future program. The best way to keep tabs on programs of interest is to sign up for our newsletter and to follow us on social. We're going to drop that newsletter link in the chat one final time. I want to thank you all for chiming in today at 11 a.m. East Coast time, but I know that we have folks from all over. So thank you for joining us from wherever you are. And a special thanks to those who donated at registration. Your support really helps keep programs like this possible and make them free and accessible. This program is sponsored by Buyer Blinder Bell, and the DC History Center also gratefully recognizes John T. Beatty, Knight Kiplinger, Sharon Rockefeller, and Virginia Weschler for their generous donations to the Collecting the City campaign. DC History Center programs are supported by Events DC and the DC Commission on the Arts and Humanities. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.
Bye.